Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. I'm Don Shelley, your host. Appreciate you joining us today for the episode where we're going to go and look at a series of events and potential fork in history that's sort of near and dear to me. As a native Texan, we're going to go back to the year 1836. Particularly, we're going to go back to late February and early March of that year. And the place we're headed to is San Antonio de Bayar. And as you might have guessed, if you're familiar with particularly Texas history and American history, the event that we're going to take a look at is relevant to the time span that we're in right now. In fact, the day after the release of this episode will mark the anniversary of the fall of the Alamo. But what we're going to look at today in the alternate timeline is what would have happened or how things might have been different instead of a protracted siege, the famed 13 days to glory that it took for the Alamo to fall. If General Santa Anna, the Mexican president and leader of the forces that had marched into Texas, seeking to quell the uprising, the rebellion that was taking place, if he had taken swifter action, and if the Alamo had fallen either more swiftly or perhaps some other course of action would have taken place that would not have resulted in the protracted 13-day siege. So today on the podcast, we're going to look at remembering the Alamo, but maybe there's nothing to remember. We'll get into that right after this word from one of our affiliates, so stay tuned. Alexis and Don here, taking just a quick break from the podcast today to actually talk about the technology that we're using to bring you the podcast. We're going to talk about Buzzsprout, which is where we host A Fork in Time. Now, you may get our podcast via a number of the other podcatchers, the other ways that podcasts are syndicated. So you might be listening on Apple Podcasts, you might be listening on Google Podcasts, you might be listening on Stitcher. But Alexis, where do we post the podcast at?
On Buzzsprout.
On Buzzsprout. When we started A Fork in Time, I got to be honest with you, I guess I'd read a few things. I was familiar with a couple of different podcast hosting sites because I'd heard their names being a podcast listener, but I had no idea what was really going to be involved with setting up a podcast. And I can tell you, it's actually pretty easy. Wouldn't you agree, Alexis?
Yes.
And the reason it's pretty easy that Buzzsprout's there to help you through every part of the process. And so what Buzzsprout is they're not just a hosting service, but they give you suggestions, and they're a platform that really helps podcasts of any size be able to get their word out. In fact, so much so that over 100,000 podcasts actually call Buzzsprout home.
Yep.
And so what we have for our listeners is an opportunity to help support the podcast and also utilize Buzzsprout services. So all you have to do is follow the link in the show notes. And if you do, because you're looking to start a podcast, they'll walk you through, believe me, they'll walk you through very easily on the website what you need to do. And if you choose to move forward there, we actually get a benefit from that. So I think I would call that, what's the word that we use for that, Alexis?
Win-win.
Win-win is the word that we use for that. And again, some of the things that I've already mentioned is we use Buzzsprout. We find it very easy to use. Uploading an episode each week, I think, is
super simple, and they even send you stats every week, which get a little addicting to look at.
I agree with that. In fact, that's another interesting thing that I didn't even, I guess, fully realize as we were starting, that immediately we'd be able to start seeing stats, not only about how many downloads, how many listens, but where in the world people are listening, all of that kind of thing. So it's not just a place to host a podcast. It's really the full support that's there. There's other affiliations that they have that allow either a novice podcaster or an experienced podcaster to get the podcast up and growing. So we don't consider anyone starting a podcast to be a competitor because we're all in this space together. So if you've been thinking about starting a podcast, what would you recommend that our listeners do, Lex?
Go to Buzzsprout. It's a good starting point.
I would agree. And so all you need to do is follow the link in our show notes and go there and you'll see what's available for you. So we'd encourage you to do that. So Buzzsprout, it's the home of A Fork in Time, and it could be home of your podcast as well. Welcome back. Today we're going to spend a little less time than perhaps we normally do. We're going to try to get better at this as we move forward with future episodes of the podcast. We're not going to spend as much time talking about the what did. We'll certainly include links in the show notes to information about what happened at the Battle of the Alamo if you're not familiar with it. We're going to work under the assumption that most people are familiar with the general scope of the battle and what is considered by historians to be its significance, perhaps overstated, but still its significance. Of course, what had happened in the period leading up to early 1836 was for the decades previous, Mexico had invited and had granted land grants to various impresarios, as they were known, who had come from the United States and had brought settlers to help them settle in the sparsely populated territories of the area that we know now as Texas, permitting them to be better held by Mexico, to deal with situations better regarding the Native Americans that were there and some of the conflicts and some of the issues that they were having. And so they had encouraged immigration from the United States in a legal form and had granted very lucrative land grants and land rights to be given out to settlers. In addition to that, though, however, there were a number of illegal immigrants from the United States into the territory that was Mexico at the time. And so that as we arrived in the middle 1830s, Texas is a combination of Mexican nationals who had been in the state or in the territory before the Anglos and the impresarios had brought in their settlers, a mix of those who were of both heritage, descended from both, and then a large number of Americans who had and other settlers who had come into the territory illegally and taken advantage of the fact that it was a wide open space. And so, with the suspension of the Constitution and some of the political changes that happened in Mexico, and concerns about from the Texians, that's what they refer to themselves as, the Texians, and their rights inside of the state and the territory that was part of Mexico at that time, an uprising began. And eventually this led to revolution, and the sources of that revolution are varied. Again, not going into a lot of detail, but there are some who simply wanted the restoration of a previous constitution, the 1824 Constitution of Mexico, under which many of these rights to land had been granted. Others were looking actively to displace Texas from Mexico and allow it to become part of the United States. In fact, it's almost an open secret of history now that Sam Houston, who would eventually become the first president of the Republic of Texas and was the general that led the Texas Revolutionary Military Forces during the Revolution and ultimately the victory at San Jacinto that won Texas independence from Mexico, that he had been sent on the behest of his friend and political ally, the President of the United States, Andrew Jackson, intentionally to try to see what he could do to get Texas separated so that it could become part of the United States. So this is the setting that we find as we draw up to the events that lead up to the Alamo. And we have a Mexican army, Mexican forces under Santa Anna, who is both president and a general, coming to quell this uprising that's happened in the territory. And so when he arrives in San Antonio in February, there had previously been a battle a couple of months back over the city itself, and he finds that a garrison, actually a mission and some related buildings and a complex next to that mission, have been converted into a makeshift fort. This is what we call the Alamo. And so while it was not originally built as a fort, it's been converted into a fort. Cannon have been added to it, and defenders have turned it into a situation, to a fortress that will be difficult to take easily with force, and it's designed to protect the interest of the revolutionary forces of the Texians against an advance on San Antonio de Bayar, which is a major city. It's the major city in the area of the Mexican nation that's known as Texas, in the province of Texas. And so when Santa Anna arrives, he finds a garrison that's manned by slightly less than 300 defenders and has been put together with some makeshift defenses. Now, in the real-time line, he lays a fairly long or lengthy siege given the size of his troops compared to the defenders. He had about 6,000 total forces available to him in his contingent of the army, again, compared to somewhere between 250 and 300 defenders inside of the Alamo. And over the space of 13 days, they systematically lay siege and then eventually attack the Alamo, with it falling on March 6th of 1836. So, given the superiority in number of forces, one of the first questions is the question that we're going to ask as we begin to explore the alternate timeline fork is, why did it take so long? Why was a 13-day siege necessary for a makeshift fort when it can easily be argued that there was at least a 20-to-1 numerical superiority of the number of forces that were available to the Mexican forces under Santa Anna, and certainly they had superior technology and arms compared to the revolutionaries, to the Texians that were inside of the fort. And the question of that can actually be answered by part of what the purpose of the siege was. While during the course of the siege, Texas declares its independence. That's actually on March 2nd of 1836. Some distance away, about 80 miles away, in a small town called Washington on the Brazos, Santa Anna intentionally was laying siege to this makeshift fort, what we call the Alamo in San Antonio, to make the point. He wanted to show a decisive victory for a couple of reasons. One of those was to show his supporters back in the Mexican capital, back in Mexico City, that he was what he was about, what he was doing here, and that he was worthy of being the leader who would bring Texas back into the fold. But his other reason for doing so was he wanted to make it clear to any other revolutionaries, any others who would want to separate from Mexico, what their fate would be. And so the purpose for the siege was not simply a military purpose to take control of a hastily put together makeshift garrison, but it had more political and psychological overtones that were also attached to it. Now, the common legend / lore of the Alamo is that the defenders there bravely stood against far superior odds, and they bought precious time, both for the newly declared independent Republic of Texas to declare its independence, but also for it to organize the army under General Sam Houston that eventually would be victorious. That's sort of the story, that's sort of the legend as we know it of what the Alamo stood for, that it was a brave stand against impossible odds, knowing that they were doomed, but for a purpose, and that purpose was to buy time and to make sure that there was a chance for success for the remainder of the revolution. There is some kernel of truth, as is often the case inside of most legends or most lore, to that. However, when you go back and actually look at the actual events themselves, it's tough to make that argument. Houston only takes command of the Army of the Republic of Texas really after the fall of the Alamo. And while there are some preparations that take place during those 13 days, running from late February until March 6th, there's nothing of the scope that historians could really point to easily and say that that was a decisive factor in what would eventually be the success of the Texian army over the Mexican troops under Santa Anna that were dispatched to try to bring the revolution to a halt. That is the story, though, however. So, looking at the alternate timeline, there's two considerations that I want to explore today, which is, what if, under scenario 1, Santa Anna had chosen to very quickly attack the fort? In other words, still actually taking military action against the Alamo, against the makeshift fortress, but not waiting 13 days to do that. Attacking in only a matter of days, and had quickly defeated and eliminated the fort as a consideration. So that's option number 1. Option number 2 that we'll look at is somewhat similar but different in the sense of, instead of actually laying siege or taking the fort, realizing that it was a relatively small force that was there, and so leaving a contingent behind to simply contain those that were inside of the structure. No need to attack the Alamo, no reason to lay siege in terms of a military action, going over the walls and actually physically conquering the structure, but simply leaving enough troops to make sure that the Alamo was contained, that it wasn't going to have an influence or disruptive element for the city of San Antonio de Bayar, or since this was along one of the major roads, the supply route that Santa Anna would need for his forces as he continued his expedition into Texas, that it wouldn't be the type of thing that would be disruptive to his strategic rear if he chose not to go ahead and eliminate the fort. So we're going to look at those two scenarios. They have similarities. I think they also have some small differences, but looking at how that would have played out differently. So under the first scenario that we'll look at, let's look at the scenario where there would have been a quick assault made on the Alamo. Again, this was not a structure that was designed and built originally to be a fortress. It was a mission with some attached barracks and other structures that had been converted into a fort very hastily over the few months that preceded the arrival of Santa Anna into San Antonio de Bayar in February of 1836. They had certainly benefited from the fact that they had a number of cannon, but for example, the cannon were actually mounted up on ramps. They were not even able to have the normal type of firing holes and portcullises and the other types of things that you would see in a fortress that would enable those who were manning the cannons to not be exposed to either small arms fire or return cannon fire while they were up on these ramps that put them above the wall. And so one of the things to note is that this was not, the Alamo was a fort, but it was not designed to be a fort. It didn't have moats. It didn't have substantial defensive works. So it would have been difficult, even for a larger force, to defend it for any period of time. It wasn't designed to be easily defended. It was better than being in an open field or an open space, but it had drawbacks as much as it had advantages. Remembering that Santa Anna has a superiority of about 20-1 in terms of manpower and in terms of mechanisms, it's easy to imagine a scenario where he would have very quickly decided to lay siege, but lay siege in a very quick way, perhaps with an immediate bombardment, a sustained bombardment, followed very quickly by an assault on the structure, finding a weakness in the exterior walls, exploiting that, and then using his superior numbers of forces to be able to quickly eliminate the fort. This could have had the same advantage that he sought of sending a message to any other rebels that were in the state of this is how it be dealt with. Could have also sounded the no quarter, could have done the same types of things. In fact, it could have even been more of a massacre than the actual assault was that happened in the real timeline. Remembering that in the real timeline, all of the defenders, for the most part, are killed inside of the Alamo, although the losses by Mexican forces were heavier than were probably expected. There were around 600 that were lost, and so about 1/10 of the Mexican forces were either wounded or killed in the process of the actual assault on the Alamo. But again, in this more expedited assault, where it's not 13 days, but maybe 3 days, the Alamo also falls with the same psychological effect that in many ways that Santa Anna wanted to carry out, and he's able to then proceed on to continue with his expedition and continue to deal with the rest of the rebellion that is not based in San Antonio. So let's talk quickly about scenario 2 so that we can cover some of the similarities between the scenarios before we talk about the differences. In scenario 2, again, you have a makeshift, poorly defended structure, a fort per se, but one that very quickly Santa Anna assesses can be easily taken at some point in the future. In fact, maybe just surrounding it and cutting it off is sufficient, that there's no need to actually engage in a military assault, but that the inhabitants will have limited supplies in terms of food and water, and in a matter of weeks at the most, they will either be forced to surrender out of starvation, or the situation would be so weakened that a smaller force would be capable of taking the fort. In some ways, that's actually what happened in the real exchange. Within a matter of 13 days, they had found some supplies, but things were starting to get pretty desperate inside of the Alamo during the actual real timeline by day 13 when the actual assault comes. So to this second scenario, leaving a contingent of his forces behind, probably maybe not more than 15 to 20%, perhaps as little as 10%, 600 to maybe 1,000 men behind. All their intention is just to do two things: to contain the Alamo, to make sure that there's no offensive action that can take place out of the Texians, the defenders who have gathered there, and also they would be occupying the city in much the same way that the larger force did, making sure there's not a continued uprising in the city. So in this scenario, Santa Anna may pause for only 2 or 3 days to sort of secure what I'll consider to be like the quarantine or the cordoning off of the Alamo, and then he's able to resume his offensive actions and his expedition against the rest of the Texas Revolutionary Forces. So in both scenarios, the quick attack, quick defeat, and in the isolation or the cordoning off scenario, it's only a matter of days that Santa Anna is in San Antonio before he's able to move out and continue on with the expedition. It's actually not until March 2nd that the convention, the group of delegates that are meeting at Washington on the Brazos, actually declare Texas independence, and things really roll forward. Part of that is certainly drawn to a head by the results of understanding that Santa Anna has arrived in San Antonio and that the Alamo is under siege. In fact, one of the early things that's going on during that meeting and during the period of time when the siege first begins in the real timeline is questions about whether or not reinforcements. Should troops be sent to try to liberate and or reinforce the Alamo, or should they be held off and put towards another cause? So under that scenario, if Santa Anna doesn't spend a long time in San Antonio, either defeats the Alamo very quickly or contains it as a threat, he's able to move on and begin to move towards Washington on the Brazos and the leadership for the revolution, which at this point probably hasn't even declared independence, or maybe by the time he's heading and marching in that direction, they are just beginning the Declaration for Independence. So if you do believe sort of the common thought, the common lore, the legend of history in that the Alamo bought valuable time for Sam Houston to gather more forces and to organize those forces, Santa Anna departing San Antonio much sooner cuts into that valuable time. And so if that is in fact the case, it's much more difficult for the Texans to gather, the Texians, to gather together their forces and have a force that can handle now a large contingent of Santa Anna's army. The other factor that goes with that is there would have been no opportunity at all for reinforcements to head towards the Alamo. And so you would have had a situation where likely the forces that had gathered to support Sam Houston would be more confined and clustered together. If Santa Anna can capture either the political leadership, the civilian leadership of the newly declared independent Republic of Texas, or very quickly engage a hastily prepared and under-equipped and undermanned primary body of the Texian army under Sam Houston, it's possible that by the time of March 6th, or certainly shortly thereafter, March 6th being the real date of the fall of the Alamo, that Santa Anna may have not only left San Antonio, but may have already engaged with Sam Houston or be closer to having him on the run. Eventually, what would happen in the real timeline is that Sam Houston would begin to move eastward to buy time by giving up territory, what became known as the Runaway Scrape, gathering forces, gathering men, gathering resources on the way. And of course, eventually in late April, the two armies would encounter each other just east of modern-day Houston at the Battle of San Jacinto, where a smaller Texian force did overcome Santa Anna's Mexican force. Almost all historians agree that the reason that Santa Anna was withdrawing east when he could have also chosen to withdraw north is that he was looking to get as close as he could to the U.S. border. He was trying to make it to what we now think of today as the Texas-Louisiana border, with the idea either being that if he drew close enough to the border, it would be risky for Santa Anna to continue to pursue him, and so there may have been a stalemate that would have existed, or the possibility would have existed that U.S. forces would have come to the aid of the newly declared independent Republic of Texas and would have only had a short distance to travel into Texas in order to be able to engage in hostilities against the Mexican army under Santa Anna. So if there's less of a time loss with Santa Anna's troops and his primary force in San Antonio, the gap between he and the forces of Sam Houston would have been closed much faster, would have been closed further away from the border with the United States, and potentially situation exists that Santa Anna may have made quick work by being more offensive and more aggressive against the forces under Sam Houston than what ultimately happened. One of the things that's often pointed to by historians that sort of led to the ultimate defeat is it was an upset, so to speak, in military terms. It was a much smaller, more poorly equipped Texian force that overcame Mexican forces at the Battle of San Jacinto. And a lot of reason that's sometimes given for that actually relates back to the personality and the temperament of the commander of the Mexican forces, that being Santa Anna himself. Because of the extended siege and the impressive victory at the Alamo, and sort of his purpose, which was really more to terrorize the rebellion than to quickly crush its military capabilities to actually be a threat to him, is that part of the reason that Santa Anna loses at San Jacinto is because of overconfidence. And so that's a result of the extended period of time and what happened in San Antonio and the fall of the Alamo. So imagining a scenario where the Alamo happens much more quickly, and again, as I've already discussed several times, there's more of an opportunity for the engagement to take place more quickly. Also might have been a case where there might not have been the same level of overconfidence that ultimately led to being part of Santa Anna's undoing. So again, under both scenarios where you have sooner engagement between the main forces, between Santa Anna's main army and also between the forces that are under Sam Houston, that actually creates another interesting dilemmas on how things would have played out. One of those is, what would have been the United States response to a scenario where they didn't have to respond in the real timeline because the Texians won the victory at San Jacinto, but what would have been the United States response if they would have had to have come more provocatively into Texas in a more obvious way in order to support or to try to avoid defeat by Sam Houston's forces? It might be argued they probably would have come anyway. In fact, it was an interesting accident of the way that history actually worked out that there was no need for U.S. forces to be involved because the Texian army was successful in winning its independence, and then there was the 9-year period of time when Texas functioned as a republic before choosing to be annexed by the United States, and of course eventually leading to the Mexican-American War in 1848. But under the scenario where Santa Anna and Houston engaged faster because of a change in outcome to how the Alamo situation was concluded, it does raise the question of would the United States have been as provocative at that particular point in terms of launching a more direct, intentional intervention by U.S. forces into Texas, and they would have had to come much further. If you look at sort of the flow of the other main bodies of the army, the Mexican armies that were marching through Texas, there wasn't just Santa Anna's army; there were other forces. They would have been able to more easily consolidate in a situation closer to San Antonio than what happened as the runaway scrape led them further and further away from the centralized territory, and then becoming more and more concerned about and having to extend their supply lines and other types of things that made it more difficult for them to be effectively an army on the march because of the distance they had to continue to cover to keep track of Sam Houston and the forces that were retreating in a strategic sense towards the east. And so one of the first questions about this earlier engagement would be, would the United States have become involved? My take on that is probably yes, but it may have looked very different. They would have had to come to the aid of the Republic of Texas. And what you actually may have seen there, so instead of the Texas Revolution, is you may actually have seen a much earlier playing out of what eventually became the Mexican-American War. And it just would have happened with a different pretext, with a different set of circumstances that would have caused it to be, but still very likely there that the United States would have been able to defeat the Mexican forces under Santa Anna. And then the question simply becomes, how far would they have driven? Would it have been similar to what was actually undertaken during the war a decade later, the Mexican-American War? Would it have been similar to the territory that was ceded as part of the real timeline of history as negotiations took place for the Republic of Texas? Difficult to know. But my bet would be on the fact that there would have been an earlier Mexican-American War. It just would have been set off by the events of 1836 instead of being set off much later after Texas joined the Union, joined the United States, and disputes over borders and other issues. One of the other considerations to think through, though, is the possibility of would there have even been, if the U.S. had not intervened, would there have been a successful Texas Revolution at any point? In other words, what would have caused Texas to become independent? My take on that is also that more likely than not, the real timeline would have eventually played itself out. There were enough Americans and those who were not originally from Mexico that were in Texas that there was definitely, without a doubt, a large enough contingent that existed. There definitely was a critical mass. There would have likely been continued efforts for Texas to break away, declare itself independent, or directly join the United States. And so while that may have been delayed by Santa Anna's win and perhaps a couple of different scenarios that could have happened with a quick victory, both of the Alamo and then over Sam Houston's forces, the macro forces that had caused this to happen were sort of inevitable. And if you look at the amount of political change and turnover that had happened in Mexico both before and after Santa Anna retaining power, even after being successful in quelling the first Texas Revolution, might have worked out differently. It's also possible that other leadership may have come to play in Mexico, and instead of a revolution being required for Texas to be handed over either to be an independent republic or more likely to the United States, you could have seen something similar to a land sale, with Mexico choosing to sell off this territory that's tough to maintain, that's full of quote-unquote all of these gringos, and deciding to cash out of the situation not by losing in a military contest, but actually by having the United States purchase the territory and gain that. Certainly there was the precedent of the Louisiana Purchase by which the United States had grown and other purchases that were made. And so the possibility certainly exists. I think it's very likely that there could have been a scenario where Mexico would have sold the territory that we know as Texas today to the United States had it not gained its independence as it did during the real timeline. Some exploration of that, you may want to look at a previous episode that we had entitled American Hannibal, where we had our guest Brent Frost, who in his elaborate timeline of what would have happened if Aaron Burr had actually become president, one of the things that he speculates is exactly that. There may have eventually been a sale by Mexico of some of the territories that we know to be the United States today. And of course, one of the impacts that we would feel if that had been the case all the way down until today. In other words, if Texas had not been an independent republic for 9 years and didn't have its own revolutionary story to tell, I can say this definitely as a native Texan and someone who studied Texas history in school and know what it is to be a native Texan, a lot of what we consider to be Texas pride, sort of that unique place that Texas holds in its own consciousness, would be a little bit different. Texans would still be proud. Texas would still be a great place. But Texas wouldn't be that lone star state, the state that had stood alone as its own republic, the one that chose to join the United States and did not become part of the United States by some other means. And so one of the longer lasting potential outcomes of a different scenario at the Alamo, a different way that the Texas Revolution would have played out and the other things that may have flowed from there, while I do firmly believe that the territory that we know today as Texas would be part of the United States, the heritage of what it means to be Texan would be quite different. And I guess for me, I would say that under that fork in time, things would be a little bit sadder. So that concludes our episode for today. Again, we appreciate you giving us a few minutes of your time and your attention as we covered this particular fork in time. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. We would encourage you to visit our website. That's www.aforkintimepodcast.com. The A is important, and the podcast is important to get you to the right place. There you can certainly have access to our complete library, our back catalog now, as the podcast's been going. We're just now about 9 months in, so we have a little bit of a back catalog there. If you're new to the podcast, we've got hours and hours of listening. I hope it's listening pleasure for you that you can go back and pick up on. If you've been with us for a while here and you found us along the way, we thank you again for continuing to join us and continuing to support the community here at A Fork in Time. And we look forward to continuing this little excursion that we've started off on and looking at how history can be different. Sometimes by just the change of a small event, how that can have a big impact. Some of the other things that you can do at the website or provide us feedback, we really encourage that. There's a place there to complete our listener survey, provide feedback on individual episodes. If you disagree with something you heard here today, I want to know. If you liked it, we want to know that too. But an opportunity to provide feedback, make topic suggestions, all kinds of other ways that you can interact and give us your understanding and your thoughts on the topic of alternate history. One of the things that I've come to realize in doing this podcast is there really is an alternate history community that exists. And so we're wanting to reach out and be part of that community and have that community be part of what we're doing here. Some of the other things that you can do to help support the podcast, if you're so inclined, if you can leave us ratings or reviews on places like Apple Podcasts, that's really helpful. Helps us to be better found in the search engines there, but also when people find us, if they see a positive review and a positive rating, they're much more likely to give us a listen or to check us out. So if you could just take a couple of moments to do that, we really would appreciate it. And again, we do value your feedback coming to the website, whatever that might be. Finally, one of the other ways that you can support us is via our Patreon page. You can find the link there on our website to our Patreon page, www.patreon.com/aforkintime. And if you're inclined and you have the means to do so and want to, you can provide some financial support that'll help offset and defray some of the cost of the podcast. As Alexis and I have said a number of times, we're not in the business of making money. If you are in the business of making money, an alternate history podcast is not the place to do it. But we have appreciated and we enjoy doing it, and it certainly helps defray some of the cost if you're able to provide some support there, and we do appreciate that. But most importantly, as always, we want to thank you for your time. That's the number one way that you can support us, and we ask you to come back and join us next week for our next episode. Until then, be safe.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.